Cool. Yeah. Hey all. I know it's kind of last talk before lunch, so I try to be as compact as possible. I came to India as well to eat some food, so. Okay, the talk today is going to be pretty interesting in one part, especially in the beginning, because I'm going to talk about decentralized finance a bit, and what is decentralized finance, or it's known as DeFi, and kind of like what kind of peculiarities it has, and how do you recognize DeFi. And the kind of idea of this talk is to try to give an understanding and maybe even kind of philosophical background to understand why DeFi is important, why you should basically try to build something. And I know most of all aren't like financial professionals here. I think most of you guys are like in college or something, right? So and probably more in tech. So the interesting part is that most people who are developing DeFi they haven't got any kind of like the financial background, and might have basically technical background. So it's like financial background isn't the limitation, and really as a developer you can actually make the current finance pretty much more interesting than it is today with DeFi. So I definitely recommend to stay awake during this presentation. So there are a few things that are very important in DeFi. So the very first thing is that what DeFi allows us to do is to grant equal access to finance. Now, what it means is basically that we have kind of like a censorship-resistant way to participate and interact with financial transactions. Now, a financial transaction might be just you sending Ethereum or DAI to your friend, or it might be some sort of lending agreement or any kind of way where you manage funds. And basically, one of the kind of peculiarities is that you are controlling the funds that you are managing. So we are talking about basically non-custodial solutions, and that basically means that we are building systems where we don't have middlemen that are basically controlling your funds. Now, that basically means that you control your funds, and when you're depositing your funds to protocol, for example, like Lendroid or Instadap or Uniswap, you basically you know what's going to happen, because the system is built by basically code that's very much immutable. Now, this brings the understanding of the counterparty risk, where you don't have a middleman controlling the transactions. And in traditional finance, a middleman might be, for example, a bank, insurance fund, or for example, a financial broker. We reduce the counterparty risk because we basically know how the smart contract is built, what kind of functions there are, and what it can do. So we can expect that that smart contract will do those particular functions. And that's basically the leveraging of the smart contracts and blockchain technology to build finance. And that's the very, very key of DeFi. And of course, there's the transparency aspect, which is, I would say, my favorite, because one of the things that transparency allows us to do, it allows us to give more information, more access, and it builds up the kind of mapping of how finance is structured. And because Ethereum blockchain is pretty much public, it's a public blockchain, basically all data is available. And when it comes to building things, what is interesting is that you can actually, as a developer, leverage that data and build different kinds of products or projects on top of this data, or to create some interesting tools to analyze. And that's pretty interesting stuff that actually we need currently in the Ethereum ecosystem. And of course, there's the kind of hypothesis of reduction of cost. We all know that in Ethereum, where when you basically deploy smart contracts or you interact, if you are not reading, you're paying gas. Now, in one way, definitely, it seems that you're paying all the time when you do a lot of transactions in high volume transaction applications, such as, for example, decentralized exchanges. Whereas, for example, in lending, you might just need to deposit a collateral and then borrow whatever you want to borrow, DAI or other stable coins. But the thing is, that cost is, we could compare it to traditional finance and how they're running their operations and services. That might be pretty competitive advantage, especially as we're running basically. I mean, once you deploy the smart contracts, they're pretty much running on the blockchain, kind of unstoppable. So there is a value proposition where we're trying to cut cost of the finance for everyone. Now, there's some mapping of the DeFi ecosystem at the moment. We'll say pretty much when it all started, it has been based on decentralized exchanges, and we have quite a few of them. And after those order matching decentralized exchanges, we basically have had liquidity pools, such as, for example, Kyber's model, which is pretty awesome, Uniswap. And recently, after the adoption of stablecoins, what happened last year is we had more and more lending facilities because many people want to earn interest on their holdings, and that basically sparked into a lot of lending activity. And recently have seen also a lot of derivative products and trading, so those are pretty cool. And I think we're pretty much like what we see here. I definitely will say that it's just a small part of what's out there. There's pretty cool projects, and I'm pretty sure that there's something going on and it will be built during this hackathon in terms of DeFi. But what's interesting here is that this is basically pretty much first layer. And what we have now seen in the DeFi ecosystem is that people are actually building different kinds of products on top of different protocols. So you might have seen a product, for example, where it's utilizing, for example, Kyber, Uniswap, and then, for example, Compound for lending, or ETHLend and other protocols. So kind of like what will be interesting in the DeFi ecosystem is not the current layer, but what's coming up. And we're still very early in the space. And I've seen, for example, even DEX aggregators where basically you can split your order to multiple DEXs. For example, 1inch was one of these projects, and there's every kind of use case there. So it's very small still. That's like my point here. But the growth has been pretty nice. So basically, since would say a couple of years now, the DeFi space has grown somewhere to 500%. And of course, this data is basically accurate, but I would say it's growing now more than ever. And I think now we have more developers and more ideas, and also kind of like we are getting the ecosystem, because it's difficult to build something when you don't have a stable coin or reserves, for example, liquidity reserves like Kyber, or lending facility to draw borrowing liquidity or any kind of staking services. So the thing is that once now we have kind of like some basis layer, the fun part starts now when basically we're seeing kind of like second layer architecture coming in. And I think that's where the most interesting traction will be. Now, this is kind of like in DeFi space, we usually look, I don't know who came up with this, but it's pretty good way to measure like growth and how big the space is. So we're looking always like what is the value of the assets that are locked into these decentralized protocols. And basically at this particular moment, there's over 1 billion locked in DeFi, which is very big amount, but it's also a very, very small amount. And most of the locked assets are in MakerDAO's stablecoin, and there is a lot of assets in Uniswap and Compound, which is basically a lending facility, and there's smaller protocols. For example, one example is our first lending protocol, ETHLend. There's something about currently 1.5 million locked assets, and I think eventually this will grow pretty much, but you can actually see that there's a lot of opportunities here. And of course, there's the DeFi Traded section. So Uniswap has become pretty popular, IDEX and so forth. So I think kind of like trading volumes are interesting to see. And trading and swapping tokens is pretty fundamental layer of the DeFi. And kind of like you can build a lot of products just by combining trading and lending. Now, for the lending space, what's interesting for me and Aave in general is that we kind of have seen that the space has grown a lot, and there's different kinds of providers where you can actually borrow liquidity and pay for that borrowings, or you can basically deposit and earn interest. So it's a nice way. I mean, if you're holding ETH or DAI and getting basically at the same time additional income, that's pretty cool. And especially when it's leveraged by decentralized technology. Now, the thing is, the current lending space is that most of the rates are pretty much variable. So how MakerDAO CDPs or the stablecoin works, that you collateralize Ether and you draw DAI, and you basically pay stability fee, which is practically, well, de facto kind of like interest rate. And now currently, the interest rates are pretty much when you collateralize ETH and draw DAI, it's 20.5. Basically, you can borrow a bit cheaper in other protocols. There's 18.37, for example, in Compound, and DYDX 17.94. So there's different kinds of options out there. And the issue here is, if you look at the borrower, who is kind of the very, very end user of the protocols, is that the interest rate, when it varies, it's very, very difficult to plan your finances. And this is very problematic for not just the borrower kind of like the retail guy who actually doesn't know what he will be paying, but also for the institutionals. So basically, for an institutional borrower, they pretty much need to hedge themselves, and they need to know exactly what's their interest rate exposure is. And if you can look from the graph, we can basically see, like from here and very beginning of the stability fee, it used to be 0.5, so 0.5%, right? So now that we are looking all the way to beginning of this year, the basic stability fee has increased a lot as basically DAI has become more popular and more people are actually creating the DAI with the collateralization, and it went all the way up to 20.5%. So it's kind of like challenging in a way that if you create a CDP and you draw 1,000 DAI by locking ETH with 0.5, and your interest will basically be annualized 5 DAI, and when the stability fee goes to 20.5, the interest you're paying is 205 DAI. So basically, you're paying 41x more than when you started. This is, by the way, based on my math, and I'm not very good at it, so I hope I hope it's right. But the point here is that this kind of increase is a lot for a retailer. Of course, for institutional, it's more about controlling risks, but for the end user, it's very uncomfortable when you're borrowing and then the interest rate gets pretty high. So it's very difficult to plan how much you're going to pay. And this problem isn't like a DeFi problem, actually, if you think a bit like extensively, because this is like a problem in the lending space. And what we are trying to do is, like, we see that we're kind of mimicking things, what's in the traditional finance, and trying to get it into DeFi and then improve. So what we are trying to do with Aave is to improve this situation by creating lending pools where basically lenders or so-called depositors deposit funds, where borrowers can then basically, lenders of course, they earn interest from that deposits, and then the borrowers can basically draw liquidity instantly. So pretty much similar pooling model as, for example, Compound. And the kind of differences to Compound or MakerDAO is that we try to kind of let the end user to control the financial situation by basically offering them interest rate swaps. So basically swapping between fixed and variable APRs. So the borrowing is pretty easy in a way that you can actually borrow variable, fixed rates, and in different reserves. So these reserves are the amounts that other people deposit for the lending activities. And of course, you can manage the deposits that you make, and also as a borrower, you can manage your borrowings. But the interesting part here is, in terms of interest rate, is that kind of like variable interest rate is the most correct way to measure the cost of the money in the current time in the market. And what fixed rate is actually it's basically a derivative product on top of that. So what we have here, like what we can see in the chart, is that the DAI, let's say for the past 6 months, it changes in the rate. So what fixed rate allows you to do is basically know exactly how much you're paying for your interest, but it also allows you to kind of control more on the financial aspect and the exposure you have on the interest rate. For example, if you see on the first, the DAI goes down, so basically, or let's say the DAI is going up, I mean the stability fee, and basically kind of if you fix at that moment, you have less exposure, and when the stability fee or our variable interest rate is going down, then basically you want to jump from fixed to variable, which is in finance term just a interest rate swap. And that's the kind of like a cool thing that we created in our protocol. And it's just like in user interface, the guy basically just presses a button to switch the rate anytime he wants. And if you don't want to manage you don't want to worry about interest rates at all, you just fix yourself on the period that you actually want, and you don't need to swap. But that's a very interesting example, like what you can build on top of like current product architecture or protocol architecture. And I think it's not like the end of the journey. You can build different kinds of products, and interest rate swaps are one product category in finance as well. So there's many things that you can actually build in the existing ecosystem. And the protocol that we are creating is basically open source, and there is a protocol level governance and pool level governance. So what the protocol allows you to do is basically to create your own pools and manage your pools. So if you want to create your own compound and manage the rates, accepted assets, and use it to a certain purpose, or you want to use some sort of whitelisting to control the borrowers and lenders, which I don't really like, because I think kind of like DeFi should be basically completely open, but there might be a use case for where you actually need some restrictions. And there's different kinds of contributions to the Oracle network and the protocol fund, which acts as an insurance fund. So basically, this is what we're building at the moment in Aave, and looking to deploy at some point during this year. And this is just a graphical overview. I think it's pretty difficult to see the whole architecture, but basically, it's an open source protocol where on top is basically the decentralized lending pool smart contracts, where you can initiate the pools, create the pool, manage your pools. You can create open pools, closed pools, and you can basically govern the pools itself. So you can grant power for the liquidity providers to decide, and for example, what kind of assets could be accepted, loan to value ratios, and so forth. And of course, then you have the consumer layer, where you have the depositors and borrowers. And what will be interesting, like to see in the future, like how this thing will evolve, because if you have multiple different kinds of pools created, I could imagine there will be some sort of like competition and different kinds of products built on top of these pools. I can imagine some algorithmic based functions where the deposit depositors could allocate their liquidity to pools that are most competitive, whether it's our DLPs, Compound, or some other lending protocol. And that's also an example how you can connect with different protocols that exist on the Ethereum ecosystem. Yeah, so a few examples. What you can build on DLPs is basically when you need liquidity or some sort of staking services, different kinds of dashboards to improve the user experience, or if you want to connect multiple DeFi products together, or for example, bridge, if you want bridge liquidity from, let's say, one lending protocol to another one which has more competitive rates. And there are stories like where people have built a lot of interesting stuff in DeFi in this hackathon. And here's, how many of you guys know InstaDApp? Oh, that's pretty cool. So this is a project that was created last year here, which is a pure DeFi project and more related to the kind of like end user experience. And what basically InstaDApp did is that they wanted to solve one big problem, kind of like a simple problem, but it was a big in a larger scale, is that it took multiple transactions to create a CDP in MakerDAO. And basically what they did is that with one single transaction, you can actually create a CDP. And that allows you easier to manage, for example, your DeFi experience, and also helps to bridge more people into the DeFi ecosystem. And I think this is very cool because, I mean, if it's hard to use DeFi, why would people use it? I mean, even if it has value proposition, but if it's very hard, I mean, it's very difficult to compete with centralized financial products. And this is very interesting stuff that these guys built here. So taking from this example, I think the things that you are building here today might be pretty big things. And as we heard today, basically hackathons are the places that the magic happens, and you never know what's going to happen. And you might build a cool product, a cool POC, which will be used by maybe not many people today, but many people tomorrow. And InstaDApp is interesting in one sense that since they built a bridge from basically MakerDAO to Compound Finance, basically they have locked over 40 million worth of assets. And if you think about it, it's kind of like pretty cool, given that the size of the DeFi user base is roughly like 10,000 users, and it will scale. The more it will scale, the more we will build easier ways to interact with DeFi, and InstaDApp is a good example that was built here. So if you have thoughts or basically like how kind of effect you can like initiate, that's a very good example. A couple of tips for the hackathon. First important thing is to be humble. We're all here to learn, so try to learn basically from your friends, from your colleagues, everyone who's around. Try to think this as a journey, and try to think like, I would say, kind of like in one way, think this as something that everyone is looking what you're doing, and like don't worry about any kind of pressure. I mean, you all have pressure. I know you will be working and hacking all night long, but try to understand also that in one way it's a place where you can be free, creative. And if you can be free and creative, then you can build something very interesting. So don't take too much pressure. Like, do your shit, but don't take it too seriously, right? And enjoy your time. Like, we're all here to have fun, right? And try to enjoy as much as possible. Keep yourself hydrated. That's very, very important. Yeah, and what I recommend to you guys is to build DeFi. Thank you. There's, by the way, in Telegram, DeFi general chat, D_5. Those guys who are interested in DeFi, I think there's half of, like, a lot of DeFi founders and team members there all across the globe, so you can get all kinds of support there as well. Our own Telegram is ETHLend, which is basically our first product, and we hang out there if you have any questions about the LPs. If you have now questions, I can take them, else I can chat with you guys outside as well. Thank you.